My name is Teresa. I'm 70 years old, and what I'm about to share is not easy to say out loud. For 40 years I lived as a cloistered nun. I entered the convent at 18, convinced that my only destiny was to belong entirely to God. I stepped across those thresholds with a simple faith and a heart brimming with hope, certain I would find nothing but peace, holiness, and purity behind those walls. For decades I lived withdrawn from the world. People imagine convent life as quiet days of prayer, sacred silence, and gentle order. The truth I encountered was far more complicated than most would ever guess. At the start, it did feel like a spiritual Eden. We rose before dawn to pray, our voices joined in hymns, our days ordered by strict routines of obedience and discipline. I believed that kind of obedience was the highest way to serve Christ. But as the years went by, a different picture emerged. I began to notice rules that had no root in Scripture, directives that didn't sound like Jesus, but like human contradictions dressed up as holiness. I watched sisters being humiliated over tiny mistakes. I saw how disobedience to a superior was treated as a worse offense than sins of the heart. Slowly I realized that, more often than not, we were not obeying the Holy Spirit. We were obeying a rigid system in which fear passed itself off as sanctity. Many nights I cried quietly into my pillow. I asked God, "Is this truly what you want for me? Is this how your love is supposed to feel?" I never stopped sensing Jesus' presence altogether, but the atmosphere in the convent frequently carried a cold stillness, something closer to dread than to peace. I witnessed things that wounded me, sisters falling ill and not receiving proper care because their suffering was labeled part of the cross. Young women who had entered with bright eyes and joyful hearts slowly melting away like candles, left without strength or dreams. And underneath it all I understood, not everything shining within those walls was light. Year after year that inner unease grew. One half of me still cherished prayer and communion with God. The other half opened its eyes and saw that something was deeply off. What I discovered, what I saw, is precisely what so many never dare to speak about. With time I realized that behind the polished front of spirituality lived a world full of contradictions. Outsiders assumed we were women entirely removed from earthly concerns. But human feelings did not evaporate at the convent door. Pride, envy, rivalry, and the hidden struggles of the heart did not disappear. Sometimes rivalry among sisters was fiercer than the unity we proclaimed. Not everyone there had a true calling. Some had been pressured by their families. Others were running from hard lives. Others simply didn't know where else to go. In time that always showed. I remember many nights when, after the evening prayers, I lay awake hearing muffled sobs from neighboring cells. There were girls, barely 20, who already felt their lives were over, all choices sealed with no room to breathe. They broke in silence. Doubts and weakness were not allowed to surface. The response we were given was always the same. Offer it to the Lord, sister. Keep quiet. Obey. There were things that shook me to the core. We spoke far less of the love of Christ than of penance, sacrifice, and rules. Punishments could include prolonged fasting, hours of forced prayer, or various privations. We were told that suffering brought us nearer to God, but I often felt it merely hardened hearts. I watched some superiors wield authority like a weight, heavy enough to crush. Mercy did not always reign. Severity often did. And we accepted it as part of consecrated life. The isolation cut deep. We were so removed from the world that many forgot it even existed. For decades I had almost no direct contact with my family. The few letters allowed were reviewed, edited, sometimes censored before reaching us. That disconnect stung. I had left my mother as a young woman and saw her again as an old one. Many times I wondered, is this separation truly God's will, or simply the will of men? And yet, not everything was darkness. There were moments when the presence of God felt profoundly real, particularly in deep prayer at the Eucharist, and in the interior silence that opens like a chapel inside the heart. Those moments sustained me, but eventually I understood that God was with us in spite of the system, not because of it. Looking back now, I know I witnessed things few would believe happen inside a convent. For decades later, those memories remain like footprints pressed into my soul. What no one dares to tell, I lived it. I learned that silence can scream. We were trained to keep quiet, to never question, to accept everything as divine will. Years later I recognized how many of those decrees were simply human choices. Choices that harmed more than they healed. I saw sisters weakened by extreme fasting or long night vigils and yet ordered to carry on because obedience matters more than rest. It grieved me because Jesus is no tyrant. He never asked for suffering without purpose. But inside those walls, sacrifice often became a god of its own. There was a young sister I will never forget, just 22, with a sincere desire to give God everything. Slowly I watched the light leave her eyes. She couldn't bear the severity, the lack of tenderness, the relentless demands. One night I heard her weeping in her cell, whispering words that haunt me still. I came looking for love and found chains. I wanted to comfort her, but if a superior caught us, we'd both be punished for weakness. So I lay in my bed and prayed silently that God Himself would bring her peace. Over the years her smile vanished and she turned rigid, expressionless, like a statue. That frightened me most, to see the flame of the Spirit smothered by the very place meant to shelter it. The lack of human touch marked me deeply. We were told affection, even a simple embrace, was earthly attachment that could derail our spirits. I entered the convent a lively young woman and spent years without the warmth of a single real hug. When you repress feeling that long, your heart hardens. You begin to forget how to give and receive love. I often wondered, how can we speak of a God who is love if we do not know how to offer it or accept it ourselves? Still, there were glimmers of heaven amid the rigidity. There were nights when, after prolonged vigils, the chapel grew so still it seemed God Himself walked among us. In those moments I felt a strange, healing peace, a balm cutting across the harshness of the day. That's when I grasped that Jesus was present, even if people had twisted much around Him. The contradiction became my constant companion. The beauty of seeking God and the blunt edges of a human structure that often kept us from Him instead of leading us closer. What no one dares to say, and I speak with the weight of many years, is that fear outnumbered love inside those walls. We were told fear was the best motivation for obedience, but I came to believe that perfect love casts out fear. Though we never said it aloud, many sisters lived with hearts clenched, afraid to fail, afraid of punishment, afraid of exposure. The joy of the gospel lay buried under piles of rules. One of the hardest lessons came when I saw how guilt was used to control. A sister would confess feeling unwell or fragile, and rather than compassion, she'd be told it was a trial from God to be offered up. I remember a sister dragging herself down the corridor with a fever because she'd been ordered to complete her tasks while ill. That image branded itself onto me. A woman given to God, handled as though her pain meant nothing. And still, yes, small, quiet love survived. I recall an older sister who, when no one watched, slipped an extra piece of bread onto my plate when fasting left me weak. That simple kindness showed me more of Christ than many of the orders I'd received in the name of obedience, because it is the small, honest acts of mercy that remain. In time I realized the convent was a mirror, reflecting the best and the worst of the human heart. I saw true sanctity in some who prayed with genuine tears. I also saw ambition, pride camouflaged as piety, and hearts so hardened that control masqueraded as spirituality. That contrast pursued me through the decades, and it is what compels me now to speak what others would rather leave unsaid. Not with resentment but with conviction. There are truths that must come into the light. What I have shared so far is only the beginning. The next chapters touch the deepest parts of the soul, things almost no one dares to name, because they reveal not scandals for their own sake, but the wounds many carry in silence. As the years unfolded, my eyes began to see beyond the surface of pious appearances. When you are young in the convent, you cling to the idea that everything that happens must be the will of God. But age and experience carve clarity into your soul. With time, gray hair and quiet observation taught me that not all decisions inside those walls came from heaven. Many were the handiwork of fallible human beings, guided more by tradition and fear than by divine love. I witnessed things that left scars on my heart. The word obedience, so sacred, so central, was often used as a weapon. The phrase that echoed endlessly through our halls was, "She who obeys never errs." Those words became a shield for every abuse of authority. They justified excessive labor, harsh fasting, prolonged silences, and punishments for the smallest infractions. I remember once being ordered to scrub the stone floors on my knees for days as penance. My offense had been speaking to another sister for longer than permitted. As I knelt, the skin of my legs raw and bleeding, I kept repeating the Psalms, but a thought pierced through the pain. Is this truly the sacrifice God desires from me? The convent, though filled with songs and prayers, also hid shadows. I saw sisters crushed under the weight of expectations, souls breaking quietly, minds growing fragile. One of them, whom I will call Sister Lucia, began to show signs of deep mental exhaustion. She couldn't sleep, she mumbled prayers to herself, and tears stained her habit more often than not. Instead of receiving help, she was assigned longer hours of prayer and fasting. "It's the devil tempting you," they said. "Pray harder." I watched her fade day by day, like a candle burning itself into nothingness. The light that once shone from her eyes turned into emptiness. That experience taught me something terrible. That silence can become cruelty when used to avoid facing truth. Loneliness was another wound that never healed. We lived side by side yet rarely shared our hearts. There was no place for laughter, no permission to cry on another's shoulder. We were told affection was weakness. So we swallowed our tears and buried our pain. The soul learns to disguise sorrow when every display of emotion is labeled sin. And yet, even in that arid desert, my heart kept whispering prayers. In the dead of night, when the entire convent lay shrouded in stillness, I would gaze up toward the small window in my cell where the faintest sliver of moonlight entered, and I would whisper, "Lord, where are you? Show me that this still has meaning." And sometimes, when despair felt heavier than stone, I sensed warmth flood my spirit, a voice deep inside saying, "I am here even when no one else is." Those moments were my oxygen. Without them, I think I would have vanished into the silence. Favoritism was another quiet poison. Some sisters were treated gently, while others, often the youngest or most timid, faced relentless scrutiny. I saw injustice, hypocrisy, and fear taking root where love should have grown. Over time I realized the true gospel cannot be reduced to commands and punishments. It must breathe life, joy, and freedom in Christ. But even in that rigidity, God's mercy kept reaching for us. There were nights when I would kneel alone in the chapel, and a sudden, invisible embrace would wrap around me. I could almost feel Jesus leaning near, whispering comfort into my weariness. Those moments of intimacy kept me alive, proof that beyond all human hardness, divine tenderness still existed. When I look back now, I can say I witnessed the full spectrum of the human soul within those walls. Genuine devotion, yes, but also fear, control, and obedience misunderstood. And that is why I speak. Not from bitterness, but from truth, because light must reach where shadows have reigned for too long. For years I remained silent, convinced that to obey was holier than to question. But I've learned that prolonged silence only prolongs pain. Within those convent walls, many holy rules were actually tools of control. We were told even our thoughts must be guarded. Superiors demanded that we confess aloud not only what we did but what we thought. If you felt tired, if you questioned a command, if your mind wandered during prayer, these were considered faults needing correction. Imagine living with the fear that even your inner world was forbidden ground. That constant mental pressure broke many spirits. I saw women who obeyed perfectly outwardly but lived as prisoners inside their own thoughts. One young sister, barely 20, once whispered to me that she had joined seeking God, but found only rules and restraint. She missed her family, her mother, the freedom to breathe. Yet she was told those desires were sinful, proof of a weak vocation. She wept, calling herself a failure, while I sat helpless, knowing that if I defended her, I would share her punishment. In time she stopped crying. Her face became quiet, resigned, like someone who had buried her soul to survive. And yet, even there, grace found us. There were moments when the night vigils stretched into dawn, when silence in the chapel grew so profound that it felt like heaven brushed the earth. In those hours I sensed God moving among us, unseen but undeniable. And that paradox haunted me forever. How his presence could shine even inside chains forged by human hands. I came to understand that the greatest conflict wasn't between faith and doubt, but between love and fear. Inside the convent, fear often wore a halo. They told us the fear of failing was sacred, that it would keep us pure. But I learned that fear kills the heart while love revives it. And though we never dared say it aloud, many of us lived trapped, terrified of punishment, terrified of imperfection. The gospel's joy lay buried beneath mountains of regulation. Perhaps the hardest to bear was the manipulation of guilt. I watched sisters confess physical weakness or illness only to be told their suffering was a divine test to be embraced, not treated. I once saw a sister with a fever crawling through the corridors to complete her chores because she'd been forbidden to rest. That image has never left me. A fragile woman, breaking her body for obedience's sake, her devotion twisted into torment. And yet, amid the oppression, acts of secret kindness bloomed. I'll never forget the older sister who would slip a piece of bread into my bowl when I was too faint from fasting. That small mercy showed me more of Christ than all the rules combined. Because love, even whispered, even hidden, endures longer than command. The convent was a mirror, reflecting holiness and hypocrisy, compassion and cruelty. I saw women radiant with sincere prayer, and others hardened into lifeless automatons, mistaking control for virtue. That tension defined my 40 years. And it is that truth, uncomfortable, raw but real, that compels me to speak today. Because what I have told you so far is still only the surface. What came later, the unspoken, the unexplainable, reached far deeper into the soul. And though it frightens me even now, those memories demand to be spoken. The silence that once ruled my life must end here. As the years passed, the mask of holiness that cloaked the convent began to crack, revealing what lay underneath. A place where devotion and control intertwined so tightly that it was often impossible to tell them apart. What few outside those walls could ever imagine is how isolation, routine, and fear can slowly reshape a soul. At first, I clung to the idea that submission was a path to sanctity. But over time, I learned that when obedience becomes blind, it ceases to be holy. It becomes a prison. We were taught that questioning authority was equivalent to questioning God Himself. The word why was forbidden. If something didn't make sense, we were told our duty was not to understand but to accept. I cannot count the number of times I heard, "The less you think, the more you please the Lord." I obeyed for decades, until I realized that silence was not always virtue. Sometimes, it was complicity. There were rules that governed every second of our lives. When to eat, when to sleep, when to pray, how to walk, how to breathe. Even our thoughts were expected to stay within invisible borders. The human spirit, however, was not created for cages. I saw what that repression did to women who had entered full of passion for God, how it drained them until nothing was left but empty eyes and mechanical smiles. Many would whisper to me in confidence that they felt trapped. Some said they heard Jesus calling them to another life, one beyond those walls. But they were too afraid. Afraid of being called traitors, afraid of the eternal consequences they had been taught awaited those who left. The fear of disappointing God was used like a chain around the heart. I too had nights when that same fear strangled my faith. Not because I doubted God, but because I saw His name being used to justify suffering that bore no trace of His love. I remember kneeling in my small cell, clutching a wooden crucifix, whispering through tears, "Lord, is this really what you want? Have I misunderstood you all this time?" In the stillness that followed, I would sense a quiet voice within me, not of thunder or command but of tenderness. "No, daughter. I am not the pain they impose. I am the love that remains." Those words, those moments became my lifeline. Few know that within the convent, there existed a secret language. One spoken not with words but with glances and gestures. A subtle squeeze of the hand, a glance across the chapel, a tiny motion of the fingers. Small acts of silent rebellion that said, "I understand. I'm with you." Those gestures were dangerous, yet they kept our humanity alive. We were women forbidden to show affection, yet starving for it. One memory will never leave me. A sister fell gravely ill. Instead of receiving proper care, she was told her sickness was a trial from God. We were ordered to intensify our prayers and fast on her behalf, as though our deprivation would cure her. I obeyed outwardly, but inside I was angry. Angry because I knew what Jesus would have done. He would have touched her wounds, sat beside her and shown her compassion. I looked at the crucifix above my bed that night and whispered, "They say this is your will. But the Jesus I know would never leave her to suffer alone." That thought terrified me, because it meant I was starting to see how far we had drifted from the heart of the gospel. The worst part was the secrecy. Nothing that happened inside those walls was ever meant to reach the outside world. Everything was carefully guarded. Pain was hidden behind hymns. Despair was masked with smiles. When visitors came, the convent appeared serene, a picture of peace and order. No one would have guessed the cries muffled into pillows at night, or the silent breakdowns in dark corners of the chapel. Even the priests who visited us only saw what they were meant to see. They praised our discipline, our holy silence. But that silence had a cost. Behind it lived women who felt invisible, who prayed not for sainthood but for freedom. There were nights when I lay awake listening to the footsteps of the superiors pacing the halls. Their presence was constant, their eyes everywhere. Even our prayers could be corrected if they weren't recited with the proper tone. I remember being told to repeat a psalm again and again until it sounded obedient enough. Each repetition drained the meaning from the words until they were nothing but sound. And I asked myself, does God truly care how perfect my tone is, or does he care about the honesty of my heart? Over time, that question became dangerous. It began to unravel everything I had been taught to believe without question. I watched the light fade from so many faces. Girls who once entered singing, now moved through the corridors like shadows. Some confessed to me that they dreamed of escape, that they could hear their families' voices in their sleep calling them home. But the fear of hell kept them bound. And yes, I too feared, for a long, long time. But something within me, perhaps the Spirit of God himself, kept whispering, the truth will set you free. No one spoke that phrase aloud inside those walls, because truth was considered rebellion. But I held on to it in secret. I repeated it to myself in the dark. And with time, that seed of truth began to grow. There came a night, one I'll never forget, when a younger sister collapsed during the evening prayers. Exhausted from fasting, she fainted before the altar. We were ordered to keep praying, to let the Lord decide. No one moved until she hit the ground. That sound, her body falling against the marble floor, broke something inside me. In that moment I understood. Obedience without compassion isn't holiness. It's cruelty disguised as devotion. From that night on, I knew that silence had to end one day. Maybe not inside those walls, but someday, somewhere. And that someday is now. Because what happened next, what I will share in the following part, was unlike anything I had ever seen. It tore through the boundaries of reason and faith, and it forced me to face darkness that went beyond human cruelty. A darkness that wore the disguise of sanctity, yet was anything but holy. At first, I thought my exhaustion was playing tricks on my mind. After decades of fasting, sleepless nights, and silence, I convinced myself that what I was seeing and hearing was just my imagination. A soul worn thin by years of repression. I was wrong. What I experienced was not illusion. It was something real, something that chilled me to the bone. There were nights when the convent's stillness felt unnatural, not peaceful but heavy, as if the air itself carried sorrow. During prayers, I would feel a sudden coldness brush my skin, though all the windows were closed. The candles would flicker without cause. And sometimes, in the distance, I heard footsteps where no one should have been walking. First I prayed harder. I repeated psalms until my lips went dry. But the more I prayed, the stronger that unease became. I wasn't the only one who felt it. Some of the sisters whispered in secret, their voices trembling. They too had seen things, shadows moving without a source, faint murmurs echoing through the stone halls long after everyone had gone to sleep. But it was forbidden to speak of such matters. They are temptations of the devil, we were told. Do not give him power by talking about them. So we stayed silent, even as the silence itself grew terrifying. One night, after the midnight vigil, I was walking down the dim corridor toward my cell. The candles along the walls had nearly burned out. That's when I heard soft sobs ahead of me. I followed the sound and found a young sister kneeling in the hall, her face buried in her hands, trembling uncontrollably. I hurried to comfort her, but before I could touch her, she lifted her head, and the eyes that met mine were not her own. They were empty, wild, filled with hatred that felt ancient and inhuman. My whole body froze. She began to whisper words I couldn't understand. A low, guttural language, nothing like any prayer I'd ever heard. My knees buckled under me as I clutched the rosary, and from the depths of my fear, I cried out the only name that ever brought peace: Jesus. I began to pray aloud, louder and louder, until the hallway seemed to shake. Her body stiffened, then collapsed against me, weeping like a lost child. I held her for what felt like hours. By morning, she didn't remember what had happened. No one spoke of it again. It was as if the event had been erased from time. But I knew. Something dark had found its way into that place, and no one wanted to acknowledge it. Over the following years, I saw more moments that defied explanation. Sisters who would fall into sudden fits of screaming during prayer. Others who claimed to see faces in the shadows. Some would vanish quietly without goodbye. We were told they had been transferred to other convents, or that they had chosen a new path. But their absence lingered like a ghost in the corridors. What pained me most was that even amid these mysteries, the outside world continued to see our convent as a beacon of holiness. Families came to visit, priests celebrated Mass, and the faithful spoke of our discipline and purity. But none of them knew what happened when night fell, the cries muffled by stone walls, the fear that crept beneath our prayers. I began to wonder whether some of the darkness we felt was not demonic at all, but born from the pain we buried. So much suffering, so much silence, it had to go somewhere. It filled the air like invisible smoke, until the very atmosphere of the convent felt haunted by despair. There came a time when my faith was hanging by a thread. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. But fear held me prisoner. Fear of sin, fear of shame, fear of being cast away not just from the convent but from God himself. And yet, even then he found me. One night, after witnessing another strange disturbance in the chapel, I collapsed before the crucifix and cried out, "Where are you, Lord? Why do you allow this darkness in a place that bears your name?" I wept until I had no strength left, and then in that absolute stillness, a peace unlike any other descended upon me. I felt warmth wrap around me like light, and a whisper stirred in my soul. "I am here even in the shadows. You are not alone." That whisper didn't make the darkness disappear, but it gave me courage to endure it. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were not just battling spiritual forces, but something far more human, the consequences of power without compassion. I began to notice patterns. Sisters who questioned authority too often were suddenly transferred. Those who showed signs of mental exhaustion were isolated for their healing. And no one ever spoke of them again. I remember the day I was punished for asking about one of them. Her name was Sister Elena. She had disappeared overnight. When I asked the Mother Superior where she'd gone, her eyes turned cold. "Do not question what is not your concern," she said. The next day I was sent to the basement, a place few ever saw. It was a narrow, damp chamber with stone walls that smelled of mildew and age. They told me I would spend the night there in reflection for my disobedience. I was made to kneel on the cold floor without water or rest. Hours passed like years. In the darkness I thought I heard sighs, faint, sorrowful sounds that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I prayed harder than I ever had before. "Lord, if you are here, give me strength." And somehow in the midst of that terror, I felt him again, quiet, unseen, but undeniably there. By the time they allowed me to leave, my body ached, but my soul felt different. I had seen too much to stay silent forever. Something inside me had changed. A conviction that truth, no matter how painful, had to be spoken one day. And I know now, looking back, that those nights in the cold cellar were preparing me for this moment, this telling. Because what I witnessed afterward, in the years that followed, went beyond personal suffering. It exposed the hidden rot behind the facade of holiness. It was the moment I realized that not all who claim to serve God are truly serving him. Some serve fear, some serve power, and some serve themselves. The things I discovered in those final years of my cloistered life, the secrets, the injustices, the deliberate silencing, are what haunt me most even now. And that is what I will tell you next. Because truth, once seen, demands to be spoken, no matter how deep the world tries to bury it. As the final years of my cloistered life unfolded, I began to see two worlds existing within the same walls. There was the world everyone outside saw, the hymns, the order, the faces of calm devotion. And then there was the other world, the one hidden behind closed doors, filled with fear, exhaustion, and the quiet despair of souls forgotten. To the visitors we were saints, but only we knew the truth. That sanctity inside those walls often came at the cost of our humanity. I saw young women arrive radiant with zeal, convinced they were answering a divine call. Yet months later I'd see that light dimmed, their joy replaced by lifeless resignation. Many never smiled again. They learned, as I did, that the price of obedience was often the slow death of the soul. One night I lay in bed listening to the rain tapping on the window. I thought about all the sisters who had disappeared over the years. Those who left for other missions, but never returned, those who broke down and were sent away in silence. I wondered if they ever found peace. I wondered if they ever found God again outside those walls. That night I whispered my own desperate prayer. "Lord, if this is not your will, give me the courage to see truth. Even if it hurts. And he answered, "Not with visions or miracles but with conviction." Quiet, steady conviction that the God I loved was not the God of fear that ruled that place. It was then I began to notice everything differently. The rules that prized obedience over compassion, the silence used to bury truth, the human pride disguised as holiness. I realized that the true danger of that environment wasn't physical. It was spiritual. It taught us to confuse submission to man with surrender to God. One of the most painful things I ever saw was a young sister, barely 20 years old, punished so severely for questioning an order that she fell gravely ill. They called it divine correction. I called it cruelty. She lay pale and trembling for days, and I remember thinking, this cannot be the love of Christ. That night, I knelt beside my bed and cried, not only for her but for all of us, women who had given everything in search of holiness and found ourselves trapped in chains forged by men's hands. And yet through all of it, God was still there. Not in the punishments, not in the rigid rules, but in the small mercies. He was in the sister who shared her bread during fasting. He was in the whispered prayers we offered for one another when we were forbidden to speak. He was in the quiet tears that fell during prayer, unseen by all but him. Those small sparks of love became the lifeline that kept my heart alive when everything else felt dead. Years later, I came to understand what I could not then. That God had not abandoned the convent. The convent had abandoned him. His presence lingered only where hearts dared to love despite the fear. But truth cannot be buried forever. And little by little the cracks widened. I began to hear things, quiet confessions from the superiors themselves, murmurs of doubt, of guilt. Some of them, too, were prisoners of the same system, terrified to disobey, bound by the fear of being seen as faithless. I realized then that the chains that bound us were not made of iron, but of misunderstanding, of centuries of confusing sacrifice with suffering, discipline with oppression, reverence with silence. There came a day I will never forget. A sister was punished unjustly and I could no longer bear it. I stood up, trembling but firm, and said, "Enough. This is not what Jesus would want." The room froze. The superior's eyes widened in disbelief. For a moment I thought I would be cast out. But instead she said nothing. No one did. There was only silence. That silence marked the beginning of my freedom. It took years more before I finally left, with trembling hands and a heart both broken and healed. Walking out of those stone walls was like stepping into sunlight after a lifetime underground. The air felt strange, too wide, too free. For a long time I didn't know how to speak without whispering. I didn't know how to cry without shame. But slowly I learned. I learned to live again. To pray freely. To see God not in rules but in mercy. To find His face not in authority but in compassion. Now at 70 years old I can look back without bitterness. Only sorrow for those still trapped inside and gratitude for the grace that led me out. I tell this story not to attack the church or to mock faith. I tell it because truth must heal where silence has wounded. Because there are still women behind those walls who believe that God demands their suffering when He only desires their love. If you are one of them, if you are listening, please know this. God does not need your pain to be pleased with you. He does not require fear to receive your devotion. His love is not earned through torment. It is given freely as light to those who dare open their eyes. And if you have ever been hurt in the name of religion, if someone used God's name to control you, remember this. That was not Him. The true Christ sets the captives free. He restores the brokenhearted. He does not build walls, He opens doors. I spent 40 years behind stone walls believing that silence was holy. But now I know the truth. Silence is only holy when it shelters peace, not when it hides pain. And so I speak. For the women who still weep in hidden chapels, for the voices that tremble in fear, for the hearts that still believe that love means submission to suffering. I speak because the truth, once buried, becomes a ghost that haunts the soul. And I will not leave this world haunted. I was a nun for 40 years. I saw what no one dares to speak of. I lived what many would rather forget. But the love of Jesus, pure, gentle, and real, was stronger than every wall, every silence, every fear. And that is the truth that sets me free.